The Debrief is a production of faculty at the National Security Affairs Department at the U.S. Naval War College. The views presented here are those of the speakers and do not represent the positions of the Department of Defense or any of its components.
Welcome, everyone, to this edition of the Debrief podcast, a podcast of the National Security Affairs Department at the U.S. Naval War College. I'm your host, Nick Vosdev, a professor in the department. With me today is Erik Brine. We're going to be engaged in a very stimulating discussion because of your background. Currently, of course, you serve as the CEO of the 401 Tech Bridge at the University of Rhode Island and the CEO of Brackish. But really why you're here for us today is your nearly 3 decades of experience both in uniform as retiring as a colonel in the Air Force, as well as your experience in the policy world across several administrations, at all points of being able to observe the defense budget, how it gets put together from perspectives in the Department of the Air Force, the Office of the Secretary of Defense, the Office of Management and Budget, and even from the Senate side, from the legislative side. So you, I think, are a unique, one of the few people who can really see this process at all points where the defense budget gets put together in terms of what drives the process. And so we're so happy to have you with us today. And just to, again, remind our viewers that we will be discussing and expressing our own personal opinions. Nothing in this podcast reflects any official position of the U.S. Naval War College, of the U.S. Navy, or of the U.S. government in general. So with that, welcome, Erik. We're very happy to have you with us as a guest. And really just to dive in with the chicken and egg question. What drives our ability to resource our national security institutions, particularly our military? Do we start with a strategic assessment of what happens in the world and we say, in order to meet these challenges, this is what we need? Or do we say, here's our pot of money, and now we have to figure out how to make that pot of money, stretch it in whatever ways possible in order to produce a military establishment? So give us your perspective.
All right. Well, first off, thanks so much for having me here. It's wonderful to be back at the Naval War College. I'm an alum of the senior class a few years ago and also the NCC, the National Command College. Phenomenal experience I had here at the Naval War College in 17 and 18. Don't retire me just yet. I'm still a reserve Air Force colonel. Right. So I appreciate all the caveats. Right. These opinions, of course, today are all of my own and don't represent any of the places that I've worked, like OMB or on the Hill, or currently for the Air Force or for Brackish experts or University of Rhode Island or 401 Tech Bridge. So getting that out of the way, to answer your question right from the bat, what came first, the chicken or the egg? Yeah. The answer is the budget. So to dive a little bit deeper into that, right? What kind of budgeting do we do? Do we budget for the strategy that's put forward by our national security experts on a year-to-year basis, or do we budget based upon resource constraints? And I think I'd answer that in typical Naval War College fashion by saying, it depends.
Depends.
Right. So I guess my first question is, who's we in that conversation? Who's the we that you're talking about? Because I think depending on what organization you sit in, where your job and responsibility is, you may answer that question differently. My background, my experience, I would say in theory, we budget for the strategy that we put forth and that we intend to execute. In reality, we live in a resource-constrained world, and we budget based upon those resource constraints. And you can go back and forth. We can argue that for sure, but there are a few things that I'd say tip the scale heavily in my favor, right? And they are that the president puts out a top line every year before you fully make the budget. That sounds a lot like a resource constraint right off the bat to me. End of story. I think I've answered the question. But outside of that, if you look at budgets and you track budgets on a year-to-year basis, like lots of folks do, whether you're looking specifically at the president's budget or following the appropriations process, you're constantly comparing the budget to its previous self in some sense, whether you're looking at an appropriation, comparing it to what the president's budget request was. If you're looking at the president's budget request, you're maybe comparing it to the last year's appropriation. Sometimes you can't do that because in years like this one, it wasn't passed yet. So the FY25 budget that the president proposes is out before we actually even have an FY24 budget. This is the dumpster fire that is our budgeting process. But even if that's not the case, you're looking at and comparing this year's PB, President's budget, to last year's PB. And you're making puts and takes based upon programs, requirements, strategy in many cases. But we don't really do zero-based budgeting, right? You're not building it from the start every year. And what many folks don't know is that that budget is built inside the agencies, comes up through the agencies of the executive branch to the White House. It really is adjudicated by Office of Management and Budget and the President and gets sent to the Hill. And they really start there. They're not zero-based budgeting either, right? They're starting with the President's budget request and moving things based upon that request, not starting from scratch and saying, you know what, I think we're going to do things different this year. Let's just start over and build things up. In the world that we live in, not only is that not practical, because there's just not the amount of time that it would take to put together something as complicated as the federal budget, not even just the defense budget, it's not pragmatic either, right? There are programs that are critical to national security that need to be continued year to year. There are agencies that need continuation and continued funding, and the amount of economic prosperity of the country that depends so heavily upon things that we do inside the federal budget, you could really cause probably serious problems if you try to just tear it down and start over.
I think that's a great point. And I wanted to come back to something you said as you were giving the answer about the Office of Management and Budget, which I think is something, a part of the process that people really don't know much about, or it just exists vaguely in their head that there's something called OMB. And to really zero in on a point you said about adjudication, right? That departments, agencies within the Department of Defense, which is a large, sprawling organization. Yes, the OSD tries to adjudicate, and then OMB has a bite at that apple of making final calls about you get this, not as much for you, trade-offs and the like. Can you maybe give us a sense of an example of the adjudication process? How does that play out where you have an initial request, hey, we think we need this much for the Air Force, and the Navy, Department of the Navy says we want this, the agencies say we would like this and that, and the budget, not everybody can get everything. As you said, you start with a top line, right? So it's clear that not everyone can get their wish list. So how does adjudication really work, even before, not even talking it when we get to Congress, but just what gets submitted in February has been adjudicated. How do we get there? How is that done?
Yeah. So I mean, how many hours do we have?
Yeah.
That's a long process, right? And I'm gonna talk at length with some students about that today. One of the questions I'll ask them is, how many budget processes do we need? Because I'll show the example of several, because it depends on, again, where you work and what part of the elephant you're touching, what your process looks like. And in reality, the process for the Defense Department is pretty dramatically different than for any other agency in federal government, right? We work over a FIDEP. We are constantly looking at multiple years at the same time, and we're in execution of 3 years at the same time. Other agencies don't work like that. And the role that OMB and the White House plays in the defense budget is different in part because of that. Now, a couple things about OMB. One, it is the Office of Management and Budget, not OPM, the Office of Personnel Management. People get those confused all the time. Everybody asks me, I've been asked many times, oh, you're the organization that lost my information in a leak. No, that was not me. Sorry, my OPM friends, that was them. OMB is a different entity, and one of the executive offices of the president, primarily responsible for the budget, but also lots of other things. And what I didn't know before I really went to work there, and what I think most Americans and most people that work in the federal government don't know, is OMB is not only responsible for putting together the president's budget, but it's essentially the central nervous system of federal government. It is the continuity of government. It is responsible for executing the management priorities as well as the building the budget. It is where things like the NDAA or authorizations start and get built from as well. So the budget is only one piece of what that organization does, but it obviously a pretty important one. And the role that they play, and I'll talk more specifically about the DoD part because I think that's what's relevant and interesting to the audience that we're talking to today. But it's actually a lighter touch, which probably seems hard to believe if you're sitting in the Defense Department to believe. But the Defense Department really having half of the discretionary funding, right, is just a behemoth. And if you really try to get into the weeds in the way that they do in other agencies, it's just not possible. There's also a dramatic respect at OMB for defense budgeting and defense budgeting professionals in not only DoD or OSD, but throughout the agencies. There are more people working defense budgets inside of DoD and the agencies affiliated than in the rest of government, right? And that's necessary because we put out these multiple year budgets. We actually maybe do better in making strategy reality than in other places. But that process, as you know, starts really with the PPB&E cycle, right? So we're talking about budgets being started 2 years in advance for sure before they ever get to the president rolling them out in January of the previous year of execution. Where OMB really starts to get heavily involved, though, is in that summer prior.
Yeah.
And again, also unlike other agencies, OMB will be involved with the process even at the agency. So as the budgets build up, the POM is built and is moving its way through OSD. By the time it's getting to OSD is really when OMB is starting to pay attention and really starting to sit in meetings with, and it's been called a variety of things over the years. It was the DMAG process when I was there, but the process that's typically led by the Deputy Secretary of Defense and honchoed and shepherded by CAPE to move through the process where they're really making big budget decisions and setting priorities, because it's around that time that they're going to start to get top-line information and know where they need to make their own internal requirements and cuts. And most of what's happening and how the OMB folks and folks from the White House are getting involved in that point are mostly listening. They're there as a courtesy. There's a great relationship between OMB and DoD. So DoD actually lets them under the hood and peek behind the curtain a little more than happens at any other agency. Most other agencies, they'll slide their budget over in the fall to OMB, and then that starts the conversation and the puts and takes. It's happening earlier in DoD, in part because there's that mutual respect and trust, and also the understanding at OMB and at the White House that they can't tackle this behemoth on their own, right? They need to delegate a lot of this authority and expectation to DoD because there's just not enough people. The national security programs at OMB is only a little bit larger in number of people than maybe the International Affairs section or the Homeland Security or HHS section, and the budget is enormous, comparatively, right? So at the time, I had the S&T and RDT&E budget that was about $93 billion for me to look at. There were parts of that touched other folks as well, but you might have a portfolio of that size. That's bigger than other agencies, right, in their entirety, and they might have 20 people to look at that agency. So you have to trust, and you have to have a greater and more continuous dialogue with the agency in this case. And it's more of an annual constant communication, right? So we're in communication with folks at the DoD level and also down into the agencies, although sometimes the DoD folks don't love you getting at the agency level when you're working from the White House. But it's just part of the reality, and it's what Congress does as well. So really where it starts to get hot and heavy is through the fall, right? And throughout the fall process at OMB, you're continuously being informed by the agencies as they build up their budget. And at OMB, you'll start to be building up your recommendations that you'll make for OMB leadership as they go through the end game of the budgeting process. And what a lot of people don't know or understand is there's a process called passback from OMB, and that's where you get to the end of the budget cycle inside of the executive branch, where now you're at the point where the DMAG or whatever the call, whatever you're going to call it, on a year-to-year basis, has kind of concluded and things have stood down and priorities have been set inside the department, and it's moved over to OMB. OMB is going to make its recommended changes, and they'll start this pass-back process. And there'll be a variety of things that'll go back and forth to make specific changes. Some will seem like recommendations, some will seem like direction, and you'll see kind of how that goes back and forth, and it depends how much political capital, the Deputy Secretary wants to put on the line to save or add or fight that. And it will be a negotiation, but at the end of the day, the White House is going to make the final decision on how that works. And there'll be puts and takes. And passback can actually happen several times. Before I worked there, I was never aware that this happened. And big muscle movements happen in this process. For example, in 2017, I remember seeing a littoral combat ship in its entirety move in the last days of passback. Pretty big muscle movement for the Navy to add a ship at that point of the process. One that a lot of them would say they didn't necessarily want. But there was a political imperative, and there was the need to balance the idea of keeping shipyards open and meeting the Navy's needs and requirements going through a transitional period. And I think the political aspect of it won the day in that example. But there are usually very few moves. But there are potentials for big changes to happen very late in the game, as they happen on the Hill as well. So even though there's a top line set and a top line set for agencies, you do occasionally see adds over the top line. And that was one example in a year where a whole littoral combat ship got added above top line.
Well, and that, I think, speaks to, as you said, it wasn't just simply meeting strategic requirements, but also defense industrial base, keeping shipyards open, keeping skilled personnel employed, and the like. And that then touches, I think, on bringing the congressional aspect, as you said, that Congress obviously, not just simply that they have a vote. I mean, they are the votes. They have to vote to pass this. And so how does Congress get involved? Does Congress simply wait until February, or are there discussions before? And then, as you said, there's respect for expertise in OMB for what DoD does. How does that play out with Congress? Is there a similar sense among members of Congress, professional staffs, the personal staffs, that expertise is resonant in DoD, or does Congress as a body feel, well, we also have expertise on this, and so we can move things back and forth? How does that play out? So, by the time something shows up in February, how much has Congress already perhaps fiddled with it, but also what then, is this is the starting point for negotiation, or is it just that you say, well, the experts have worked on it and we may tinker at the edges, but, give us a sense of what happens when this, after, summer and fall within the executive branch, and now that Congress is formally brought in the spring, what happens then, what you saw and what you think viewers might be surprised by.
Yeah, I'll try to remind me if I don't hit all those questions.
No,
I'll try to take all of them. There are a few there. So the first, is there that same mutual respect? And I could go back to it depends, but instead I'd say yes, no, and maybe.
Okay.
Or sometimes. So it really depends, because Congress, I think, as most people here know, is much less of a monolith than the executive branch is, which isn't either, right? Even though it's run by an executive, still a lot of voices at the table, a lot of opinions, a lot of silos. That's dramatized in spectacular fashion once it hits the Hill, because there are those offices, those committees that have great working relationships with folks in the Defense Department, others that don't. There are folks on Congress who have very little to do with things in the defense space and maybe only touch the budget or an authorization when it finally comes to a floor vote, because they're pretty far away from it. But everybody wants to play in that space, right? Because it's half the budget, and when you start talking about the NDAA, it's the Christmas tree of bills that everybody wants to hang an ornament on, right? Whatever your belief is, you want a part of that process, because it's one of the only bills that passes on a year-to-year basis. So whatever your thing is, you want to find a way to make it military affiliated and put it in the NDAA, because it's maybe its best chance at actually becoming law. For sure, on the appropriations staffs, there are great relationships. On the Armed Services Committee staffs, there are great relationships, and oftentimes great relationships between the staffers that are on the Hill and those that are in the executive branch as well. I would very typically go and spend time with my counterparts on HASC and SASC and the SACD and HACD when they would go to do staffer days. And those were really based upon one of the most important things that I learned in my time in government is just like it exists outside of government, relationships are everything, right? And the way to be successful in your job, whether you're in government or out of government, is to build trust with the people that you need to work with most. And most do that pretty effectively. Where I think you start to see the biggest challenges is as you get further afield from the expertise, right? The people that don't necessarily understand, that certainly don't have those same relationships, and also the more that politics plays in it, the more that you have sometimes those challenges and the fraying of those things. Now, how does Congress and when does Congress make effect to the budget? Also an ongoing cycle, right? That's happening throughout the year. It's more, I think, continuously more and more challenging because those cycles don't move on time in any fashion. So in some cases, that actually hampers their ability because it's hard for them to really start tinkering with the FY25 budget before the FY24 budget is out. And then once the FY25 budget is finally starting to be worked, because they just released the FY24 budget, they've compressed their own schedule. Maybe not in reality, because I think they all believe they're not going to pass a budget by October 1st either this year. So maybe there's lots of runway, but the problem is it's uncertain. You have no idea when it is. So if you're working on a staff there, you know the timeline that you're intended to meet or that's laid out, and now you've given yourself a much smaller window to affect the necessary change and do due diligence on that budget. So you get crushed in this smaller period of time and then end up waiting. During that waiting time, there's time to affect the budget as well. Nothing is done until it's done. So you see injects all throughout that process. So you will see Congress continuously being involved and looking to tinker in future years' budgets and trying to set strategy in some cases in others. But there are other ways that they're doing it throughout the year as well. I guess nobody's going to see this before I talk to the class later, but I'm going to ask the class later is, what's the FY24 defense budget? What's the number? Somebody give me the number. Nobody can give me that number. Because that number doesn't exist yet. It's not the end of FY24, right? We may see a slew of additional supplementals or bills. There's large Ukraine funding out there that I really hope gets passed very soon that's needed. That's going to change the defense budget over the course of the year. You can also change numbers and make them look however you want based upon what your political stance may be. I think if you go to the House and Senate appropriations summaries of the bill, there are different numbers in them. Just depends on what you're counting, right? You can do interesting things with budget numbers. But there are opportunities to move those numbers throughout the course of the year. In some cases, you see big things like supplementals, but there are also lots of opportunities for things like reprogramming actions that are regularly happening throughout the course of the year. That oftentimes they're not going to change the top line of the budget, but you're moving money in sometimes big ways inside the budget cycle.
Inside the budget cycle. No, I think that's pretty critical. So much that we can discuss, and I hope that this gets our viewers thinking, but I cannot let you leave without bringing in the technology question, simply because you're here.
Sure.
And the expertise, which is how do we, you talk about, the DoD in particular has to think multi-year budgeting, and we think programs of record that can last years or even decades, and yet technology doesn't stand still. We can see radical changes, disruptive changes that can occur within a matter of months. How are we handling the question of thinking, planning, budgeting for the future with the unknown of what the technology sector can and can't produce, and also the extent to which we are thinking or planning in the hopes that there will be a technological breakthrough that we'll be able then to factor in 5 years or 10 years because the technology will be able to do what we ask it to do. So how does technology, the budget process that you're laying out here, which is already unwieldy and unpredictable, and then a technology sector which absolutely refuses to be governed by any sort of planning of, this year we will make this breakthrough, and then in 3 years we'll make this breakthrough. How do we integrate the disruption of technology into this process?
Yeah, it's a massive challenge now, right? I think as most people realize today, technology is evolving faster outside of government than inside of government. And that wasn't always the case. And it certainly wasn't the case when the process that we're working inside of was created. So you see the rise of interesting organizations and innovation organizations. A lot of that happened while I was at the White House, watching organizations like Defense Innovation Unit stand up, National Security Innovation Network, Ensign, AFWorks, eventually Army Futures Command, Naval X. There were programs that were kind of like some of those that were out there already, rapid capabilities offices and places like DARPA that do it well. I was there for the rise and eventually watched the downfall of SCO, the Strategic Capabilities Office, which is a very interesting story in of itself that recognized some of these things. All of these offices know that there's a challenge that new technologies are evolving faster than we have time to program and budget for. And if we don't get to them early, they will move and go to just private sector requirements, or even worse, potentially to our adversaries, right? We're seeing regular challenges in that space with joint ventures or acquisitions in technologies, and that's a real problem. And many of these organizations are trying to do things to get after them. The problem is that's in direct conflict with the way that we budget and the way that Congress typically looks at their role, right? Congress wants a good understanding of what the budget is going to be used for. They do not like blank checks. They want to see line by line program elements inside budget areas that they can point to and say, I want this program to continue to move forward. This program is underperforming. You need to tell me what you plan to do inside of this program because I want to know if it's a good idea or not. It's hard to say, I'm going to put $6 billion out there because I think something exciting is going to happen next year. That is not a winning argument.
No.
Every time I've seen it on the Hill, it is challenging. But in reality, it's what you need, right? And it's why you see organizations like Office of Strategic Capital starting. I've got lots of friends in these organizations that are trying to lean forward and do innovative things in government, and you need flexibility to do it. I see it on the outside now. When I left OMB and decided to move here to Rhode Island, I wanted to be able to work in organizations that I could try to affect some change and be able to help organizations that are trying to be innovative, do new things, navigate that. So I advise a lot of small businesses in a couple different roles. And one of the things I'll tell businesses that are looking to do defense-related things is, first off, make sure you're in the dual use space, right? That you have a military application if that's, if you think there is one, make sure you have a civilian application to your technology as well, because DoD partners are great customers, right? There are big contracts there. There's a lot of potential. From a national security perspective, we need your expertise. We need your technology. If they're your first customer, they'll kill you. Because they don't pay on time, oftentimes, and it's a long time to get to a contract for some of the reasons that we mentioned. So some of the things DoD has tried to do is leverage more with like the SBIR program, Small Business Innovative Research, that frankly is money that hasn't always been particularly well spent, and do more flexible things in this space with it. But still, that's a challenging vehicle. The vehicle sizes are not always the appropriate for the technology advances that you're trying to make. Some of these other programs are looking to do things to invest early and do things like InQtel has done for years, and that's been some of the model for what's been trying to be done inside of other DoD organizations at times. But it's challenged for sure by the budget cycle that we live in.
Well, I think that this has been a fascinating conversation. I have so many more questions, and as you said, how many hours would we have? So thank you very much for joining us. We certainly will hope to have you back as we watch developments in this space. So with that, I'd like to thank our audience for being with us today, and we'll see you on a future edition of The Debrief.